Well, we can get into that now. I mean, we can start talking about the mechanics that are, and I think Constellation is a good place to start. And like I alluded to earlier, the thing about Constellation is that Constellation doesn't care about what is unique about enchantments. It just cares that you have them, that they're in your deck. What that does is it doesn't really put that much of an onus on the player. It puts an onus on the designer to just toss a ton of enchantments that people will want to play into the set so that you incidentally just have a bunch of enchantments in your deck. And occasionally you have to count how many they are and decide if a constellation card is good enough for your deck, which, is something, but I don't know it's the greatest design hoop. It's more of like a signal that, yes, we care about enchantments. But in original Theros, it cared more about things unique to enchantments, the fact that auras target. There were other things too. Oh, the fact that they're on the battlefield adding to devotion.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't get that same sense here, that they've thought long and hard about what makes an enchantment an enchantment. They've thought long and hard about what makes Constellation work and what can help players feel like it's an enchantment set. To which I have the hot take, what if Theros did not care about enchantments? Like, what does it lose?
I mean, I think it would have been better if they had just... I think it would have been better if they'd have just crossed off the constellation, but had enchantment creatures when the creature was really an enchantment creature. And I think this is a fight that goes all the way back, at the very least, to the original Mirrodin, because enchantment as a type is...
Yeah, it's just hard.
So loose in terms of what it's supposed to be and like what makes something an enchantment, what makes something an artifact. But I do think there are things that you could say, like an enchantment should be a permanent type, so it should do something on the battlefield that is distinct from what a creature does. And so, like, anything where it has some ambient ability, and that's what they did in the first Theros, to at least say, like, if this is an enchantment creature, it's going to have a static ability that would be something comparable to an enchantment. Although they did get a little cute, and then they also did this with when they were trying to make Delirium work with having these enchantments that really
were spells that you cracked.
That are really sorceries, and I hate that. That is like everything I hate in design is when you have some word that means something, and then you just make that word just like a sticky label that you're putting on the card rather than it having any meaning.
The
problem with Devoid was like, well, we want colorless to matter, but we don't want colorless cards in our set, so we're just going to make a random subset of our cards colorless. I think they ended up doing that to make Constellation work, and it led to similar sort of murky feelings of like, if you want to make an enchantment set, fine, but you have to make a set that cares, as you say, about enchantments and the things enchantments do. And they definitely didn't do that here, in my opinion.
Yeah. I would say I am both so much in agreement and so much not on some particular cases.
I like the Omen cycle, which is exactly what you're complaining about. But I like how they did it in many cases. It feels clever to me, and I'm okay with it. But at the same time, when I step back and I think about your argument and I look at the set, I'm like, okay, you're right. It is just kind of a label. There's some designs, like there's the common enchantment creature Skola Grove Dancer that has an enchantment ability on it. And like, when I first saw that, that was one of the early things that were spoiled unofficially. I was like, oh, so their enchantment creatures all still have enchantment-like abilities. I'm glad they did that. And then the next pack had the vanilla enchantment creature. I was like, oh, or not, I guess. Anyway, sorry, Trevor, I interrupted you.
No, that's a fantastic transition, because vanilla enchantment creatures were exactly what I was hoping would appear in Theros Beyond Death. And that's my big sticky disagreement here, is that I think I agree that enchantment and artifact is a loose, broad definition, and we are so very forgiving to artifacts for it, but we're so very strict on enchantments, and it does not make sense to me, right? I think that, unfortunately, it's just a historical thing that artifact creatures have been around forever, and that they started with a certain definition, which was they are colorless. And now you have non-artifact colorless creatures, you have colored artifact creatures, and they have such an obvious apparent flavor to them, which is they are artifacts, they are constructed, they are built, they are designed, whatever you want to say, right? So then with enchantments, it's so much harder because unfortunately, historically for enchantments, a lot of things that in my opinion should have been enchantment creatures are not. I rail people with this argument all the time. I personally, in my sets, I might just do this, which is elementals, enchantments, illusions, enchantments, spirits, if they're not ghosts, enchantments, art avatars, incarnations, all those things should be enchantments, right? Because they are creatures made of magic. Artifact is a creature that is man-made or made, constructed out of physical substance with magic. But enchantment creatures are creatures that are held together by magic or built out of elements and insubstantial avatars and ideas, right? And I think that would be the way to go about it. They tried that in Theros with the idea of Nyxborn, like they're infused with the stars and all that, but they really could have leaned into that harder. And now, like, it's actively undermining the argument because you get some random weird enchantment creatures that really don't feel like it, and they're not actively taking the effort to make them feel like it. But then you get stuff like nymphs who feel great. Like nymph is a perfect type for enchantments. It is a creature made out of, like, enchanted into the wood. You know what I mean? Like it's good. And so, in my opinion, I think that would go a fantastic distance towards helping enchantment creatures make sense. And I think without that very explicit leaning on that identity, you do end up with these cards that just do not feel right, and you end up with these overburdened cards that are trying to have enchantments, and it doesn't work because all creatures have enchantment abilities when you really look at it,
Yeah.
And that's difficult. I also agree that caring about the unique qualities of enchantments would help, and in fact, there's a fantastic avenue for that. Auras are very fragile and specifically help creatures. They are support based. There's other kinds of auras, but we don't talk about those now. And then there are global enchantments that have wide sweeping, impactful effects typically, or activated abilities. And they tend to be very resilient. It's very hard to get rid of an enchantment when it's not a creature. Like, look at the Remembrance card from Ikoria. People love it. It's Blood Artist, but it's on an enchantment and it makes a token instead of actually being a creature. It's so much more resilient,
Yeah.
And then auras, they're widely found to be difficult to use and design because they are so fragile and vulnerable. You have this fantastic duality. Why not use it? Why not define enchantment creatures, if they're vanilla, as being either extremely resilient or extremely fragile?
And one thing that's unique to enchantments is they're often really unique creative build arounds, right? Like some of the most beloved cards in Magic are built around enchantments. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if there's some mechanic that can lean into that. I kind of want to say something like Champion, but not actually Champion. But in a similar way that Champion leans into build around, the build around nature of a card.
Yeah, I don't want to pollute this with custom Magic talk, but we have actually talked about this. I have tried to design enchantment sets that were not aura sets.
Yeah.
The number one place I went to was, is there a way to create the build around feel and encourage the build around and facilitate build arounds? Because that's what they really need. You don't need to make a mechanic that is built around. You need to make a mechanic that lets you draft around these build around cards if you're going to stuff your deck with them, right? Because you design an entire deck around one card, it's hard to get. So guess what? Theros already has that mechanic. It was called Scry.
Yeah.
Scry helps you get to the build arounds or get the things that you build to work with, right? And so they could have leaned into that more, and they don't. There's a lot of different things there. On the other hand, I completely agree that they really contorted themselves into some weird spaces with enchantments. They're trying. Like the Omen cycle, I think, is better because there is an actual reason for it to stick around on the battlefield. This idea of like the fonts in the original Theros sets, those were okay because the idea is that you're paying in installments, and that's not something that's easy to do with sorceries. Even when Sagas first came out, I just looked at them and I'm like, God, this is just a sorcery. It's just a long sorcery, right? It should have just been like, its type line could have been sorcery, And instead they're enchantments, and that's really, to me, it feels odd. I get it. I know why. And if you are using that technology already and you're leaning on it, that's the kind of thing you can lean on more. Those kinds of things don't feel contorted to me, but there's some other stuff that really does. And that it's just odd. It is definitely a set that started to lose sight of how to care about enchantments in a unique way. I would agree with that.
Well, that's a good segue to talk about sorceries or sagas, as many of us think of them. Yeah, we've talked about them already. It makes sense to include them. I think especially with Escape, the fact that you have enchantments that go to the graveyard is nice. It brings a lot of the resonance of the setting in. I really like... I think I prefer them as a type to Planeswalkers, because Planeswalkers create these little sub-games, right? But they're sub-games that if you don't win them fast, just completely take over the game. Whereas Sagas, the ceiling is lower because they're going to go away, the one-time effect is going to happen, and then they're gone. And I just like how it makes players think a couple turns ahead in a way that can affect a game, but not necessarily dominate a game. Any other thoughts on Sagas?
A thing that happens a lot is that a mechanic gets previewed or whatever, and I'm like, oh, this is awesome. And then I see the set, and I'm like, okay, all of the cards that have this mechanic are terrible.
Yeah.
Like Aftermath would be a sample example. And so what I take away from that is that the mechanic is exciting, but either the design space or more often, I think, the development space of the mechanic is really narrow, so you just can't get good designs out of it. And if this had been the first set with Sagas, I definitely would have felt that way about Sagas, because the Sagas in this set are
garbage.
Yeah, I was trying to find a more diplomatic word, but sure. Whereas they were such a hit the first time, and I just like there's one Saga in this set that I like. And maybe like two if I stretch it to like define to include cards that are so powerful that I would always play them.
What's the one you like?
The one I like is the one where you name the card you're going to play the next turn.
That's a fascinating one.
Weird enough, and like it sells that it's about a prophecy. And I mean, I hate that there's this fourth line on it for no reason about looking at the top card of your opponent's library for who knows what reason. But just to try and find a saga I like, this is definitely my favorite as far as like really taking advantage of this fact that it's something that's going to happen in phases, and the phases are actually related to each other in a direct way, which I don't think they've done before. So I liked that idea, but mostly it's just...
So... Oof. When I think of the sagas individually, I feel like they either have one of two problems, which is that it's all top down to the story, like Elspeth conquers death. And so the three things are Elspeth conquering death, but the mechanics don't feed into each other at all. So it's like all lore top down, or it's all mechanical bottom up, and it doesn't match. I don't feel like there's any story here. So like the Binding of the Titans, everybody puts cards into their graveyard, you exile a couple cards, and then you return a card to your hand. Like, I don't feel like I'm binding any Titans there. I feel like this is just a really slow Eternal Witness. You know what I mean? My favorite saga is the first of Rowan Games, because that one I think the mechanics do feed into each other in a way that makes sense, and it matches a resonant trope. But then the creating a gold token at the end just feels like trinket text, which kind of, I think, detracts from the whole package a little bit, although it is cute.
I think what I would say is this. I agree with minimized prophecy. I will note on an individual card note, the reason that it has the fourth line is because they didn't want to sacrifice it on 3, because then you might forget that you are going to draw 2 cards when you cast that spell.
Oh, that's smart.
So they needed it to stick around, but they should have given it something besides look at the top card of each player's library. Come on. And
yeah.
The first of Rowan Games I really enjoy, but again, they probably should have put the gold token with the number 3, and they didn't for some reason. Like, I don't know why you're winning the game if you don't control the big creature, you know?
Yeah.
Maybe it did at one point. Maybe they really, really wanted to show off that they can go to Act 4 now, you know?
I think they did, because that was like their new space for sagas.
Which so that nobody notices. I completely forgot they didn't go to Act 4 in the first set. So
Agreed.
I'm being hyperbolic when I say they're garbage, but you definitely get a very different vibe with Sagas. I don't know what the difference in DNA is, but I think it's honestly the fact that they didn't have as close of a connection to the beginning of Sagas as they did. Sagas started from a really interesting, exciting space, and they slowly became a different, interesting, and exciting mechanic. And I think that put them in the right mindset to imagine these not as long sorceries, but as what you were saying, they are almost like mini games, ways to think ahead, which is a thing that enchantments do very, very well. Enchantments are typically about lasting impressions upon the board, whether they're auras or whether they're gold enchantments. Their entire idea is to radically alter things and have you plan ahead on how to use them in the future, right?
Yeah, but then you look at like Kiora Best's the Sea God, and what story is it telling your opponent? It says, on this turn, you're not going to be able to deal with this. Next turn, you're going to lose. And then if you don't lose that turn, you lose the following turn.
Exactly,
like,
right?
it doesn't play into the space of, oh, it's fun that players can look ahead to what's going to happen next.
Exactly, right? It doesn't matter that the card is telling you what's happening ahead because there's like nothing you can do about it, right?
Yeah.
The only real thing that, like, I might be misremembering even, but you get tapped out, right? You don't even get to untap the next untap step, and then they get to steal something yours, and they create a token with hexproof immediately, right? And so there is literally nothing you can do about this card. It's not the fun kind of Saga because you can't play with it. It's not.
It's just flexing, right?
Exactly, which is exactly what people say about the card, right?
Yeah.
Sagas began with the concept of being a minigame, and that's what gave them the beauty that they had in Dominaria, is that even when the DNA evolved into the simpler form, they still were designed with the understanding of what they are, which is minigames. Sagas in Theros Beyond Death are designed to be sagas, which means they were designed to exploit the mechanical opportunities of a saga, which is completely separate from the actual interesting part of the saga. And you see that so much in this.
Elspeth's Nightmare, now that I'm looking at it, kind of does that. Like, you know, on the second mode, they're going to duress you. And so that kind of affects... You can work around that a little bit. And then the third...
Oh, sorry.
Well, and then the third mode exiles your graveyard. And so you also have to think ahead that way. But
I would pick that as one of my favorites, actually.
Then the first part is so dinky and unrelated to the rest of it.
Yeah.
It's a flavor thing, I think. It's one, to give it some function right away, because the other stuff is a little more nebulous. And two, it's to represent that Elspeth's witnessing innocent people die, etc. And so it has to be a tiny thing that dies, so on.
It's like what I was saying at the beginning, where, half the sagas are just the story top down, and the other ones are mechanics that actually feed into each other, but it doesn't feel like a story.
Right. And they lost sight of the actual minigame aspects. I don't know how Dominaria did it so well. I think it helps that they had such nebulous stories to work with, because their minigames were also built to be pretty solid tellings of Dominaria's history, I think.
There's also, when you have a new mechanic, there's this kind of exciting gold rush of, where is the space? Like, how far does this space go? And like, what if the first mode is a downside, with like Flame of Keld, where you discard cards, and then it's a risk reward thing.
Exactly.
And they do say they like to reserve some space so that when you return to a mechanic, you can do some of those things. But I think there is just something natural when you're designing a new mechanic and you're like, what are all the things we can do? And you just kind of naturally find some of the most exciting low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, I would agree with the idea of reserving space, and I think that's honestly one of the problems of Magic sometimes, is that they gobble up all the good space, and so they either get left with one of two ideas, which is one, let's throw in some of the garbage now, that way we have some good stuff for the next time, right? Which they've literally said they do sometimes.
I don't know that they consciously do that.
No, they basically literally said, they're like, we saved this good design for the next set. Right? The next time we come here, we'll do the good idea that we had the first time. And I'm like, okay, why not? Like, that's weird,
Yeah.
The second one they do is they gobble up all the good space, and then what the space they reserve is that creepy, dark cobweb corner that nobody wants to go into, right? And that's kind of what happened here. Is they showed off the mini game potential of Sagas. Like, okay, what's the other things that Sagas can do? And it was
we could put more text on the card.
Yeah, it's the two kids that they didn't pick the first time for Dodgeball, which is that you can use it to do 3 different sorceries, awesome, or you can use it to tell a top-down story that mechanically tells you very little, right? So Sagas are like, it was so much potential, and I really think, like I said, immediately everyone knew that Sagas were going to return. It was 100% guarantee, and I think they've really lost sight of the way to do it. I think the key was to preserve the minigame feel, to remember what it was that made Sagas work. And then 2, like we were saying about Dominaria had a really nebulous, broad way of handling the Sagas that worked well. Like, it was not hard to find a matchup for them top-down wise.
Because you have all of Dominaria. You can find the story to match the mechanic.
Right. And I think they could have done that if they had tried a little harder, right? Not to imply they're not trying, but like stuff like the Birth of Meletis, these are 3 unrelated mechanics that vaguely tell you to be in a control deck, I guess. But for the most part, like, I get the story it's telling. You find the land, you build the thing, you prosper. Cool, right?
Yeah, but if I'm the opponent, I look at Birth of Meletis and I think, oh, so I don't have to care about any of this.
Yeah,
like, exactly. Is this going to happen?
There is no minigame. And that is the kind of thing where it's like, okay, you shouldn't accept this as the proposal for this saga because it's not capturing the part that makes sagas fun. I don't think the opponent has to care about it either. I think it needs to be something that someone cares about. This is the kind of card that,
fair.
Like, I was just having a conversation about this earlier, which was someone was talking about, like, well, with some mechanics that build up over time, what if players forget to do the thing, right? I'm like, nobody's going to forget about a saga because you're excited for the next part of the saga, right? That is cool. Either 1, you need it because it's Flame of Keld and you just discard your entire hand, or 2, you're excited to pay off for the thing you've been planning on. So you very rarely forget about them because you're actively thinking about them. With Birth of Meletis, that might just be on the board the entire game. Like, oh shit, I forgot to actually put stuff on this.
Yeah, it's weird when it doesn't end with a flourish. Like, oh, exile their graveyard, or gain 2 life, or look at the top card. Yeah, like look at a random card in their sideboard, you know what I mean? Like,
so often they end up with this weird whimper, and I think in some cases it's better than it looks. Elspeth's Nightmare, I was sold on it after I watched Loading Ready Run when they were doing their initial stuff, and they played this. They had someone play this on them, if I remember correctly, and they had a lot of escape cards. They were a self-mill deck. And so they immediately were like, we need to hustle. We're losing the game right now.
Yeah.
We're about to get rid of a card in our hand. They're about to destroy one of our only creatures because they did not have a lot of creatures at the moment. And they're going to get rid of all the escape cards we have that are the only things keeping us alive, right? So they immediately started strategizing about how to deal with all the stuff going on. That was the ideal scenario for Elspeth's Nightmare. And does that happen a lot? I don't know. But that is the thing that makes that kind of card work. I think it looks like a whimper in the set, but exiling your opponent's graveyard does matter a lot more in this set. When they have all
in the
these
format
escape cards they've been building up to, and now they suddenly have a clock on those escape cards.
I feel like set design had a lot of fingerprints on the sagas. Like, a lot of them have very specific roles for archetypes or play patterns, unique to limited or unique to specific constructed themes. And I think I preferred the Dominaria, like, this card just is what it is. Like, it stands on its own.
I would agree.
I think...
Oh, you go ahead, Tommy.
I think another key difference that at least really stands out to me is that in Dominaria, there was historic, and the sagas were historic. They were things from thousands of years ago, and that resonated and made it feel like an enchantment in the sense that this is a story that's been told and told and told over generations, and now it's sort of gotten this thing that we're going to talk about it. And even, I mean, of course, for me it was great because I remembered these things happening, but even if you didn't, it still had that sort of mystique to it. The sagas in Dominaria weren't about the things that were happening in the set Dominaria. Here, there are things that are just like part of this story, I guess, and that really sort of like makes it not feel like a saga. It's like just the current events news, which makes it feel tokeny. And then when they throw in abilities like look at the top card of your deck, it just does not. It just makes it feel even more tokeny that these things are happening.
Right. Yeah, like Minimized prophecy is a prophecy, but it doesn't feel like an actual saga. Like that would be a terrible bedtime story. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You get cards like the best sagas are stuff like Triumph of Anax, which if you know what the top-down lore is, you go, oh, that's the Trojan War, right?
You're talking about the Akroan War?
Oh yeah, sorry, the Akroan War. Yes.
Yeah.
You look at the Akroan War, the Triumph of Anax. I have no idea what's going on with that.
Hold on, I'll be right back. Keep talking.
That's why I mixed it up. Was with Triumph of Anax, I was about to mention, I have no idea what's going on in that card. What's the saga here? What is Anax doing? I thought he lost. Didn't he get turned into a weird, like, mindless demigod in this set or something? No, I guess he wins. Okay. And that is a serious problem with the implementation of a lot of this set, I think, is that they had the potential, again, with the Underworld, with this, and it got lost at some point along the development of the set, and it sucks. Like Birth of Meletis, that was in card-by-card design stories, if I remember correctly, and they revealed that the final mode used to be that you would gain life based on the number of creatures you control. And that would have been a much better final mode because, one, it's a flourish. You're about to gain a bunch of life. And two, it actively makes sense with the first two modes. It's something your opponent will be trying to stop you potentially. They don't want you to gain a bunch of life, so they're going to start trying to pick off your creatures when they might not have.
You're talking about Birth of Meletis?
Yes.
Yeah, it also, you start looking to the third turn and how you can build up to it.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
You start caring about that. You now care about that wall that you made because you actually want to keep it alive. The Plains card you get matters because it helps you play more creatures. So much of that card, once you know that third step used to be different, makes sense. But the third step was removed by play design because it was not working properly for the decks they wanted to put it in.
Yeah. Play design is very interesting to me because... Yes. In custom Magic, we have our own custom format of custom sets, and it's very fascinating how much thought has to go into designs you push for constructed, like you won't expect them to see play in constructed, and you have to really think it through, and it becomes readily apparent how bad we are at that. It's a completely different set of skills. But then sometimes you look from a design perspective at all of these designs that just seem strictly worse because they needed to do something in play design. Just an interesting balance of priorities,
Yeah.
I really care about cards in a vacuum. That's a thing that I personally, as a designer, I really hate it when I look at a card and I'm like, what on earth is this doing? This makes no sense. Yeah. And I think it's great when cards then also interact nicely with other cards in whatever environment, and all of that sort of thing is great. But I agree that I would much have preferred that this Birth of Boletus makes sense as a whole, and at least from one perspective, if the last ability had something to do with the previous ones.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is the last step of our saga of talking about sagas because we have to move on. But I already forgot my point. So yes, we are now moving on. That was the fourth step. We are escaping. Oh, wait, no, devotion. Let's talk devotion.
Devotion first.
Oh, okay. We're devoted to moving on.